Hello, and welcome to Leeds Echoes. In this series, we plunge into the fascinating depths of Leeds' rich history. Through a sequence of intimate audio vignettes, I'll try and shine a light on the often overlooked and try to understand what it felt like to live in the Leeds of before, so we can better understand the city of today, and more importantly, the future. For this episode, I wanted to try something a little bit different. Throughout the course of my research over the last decade, I have amassed a rather large collection of utterly fascinating documents, the majority of them digital. Whilst most episodes of this series draw upon numerous of these sources simultaneously, I feel that some of these documents stand just as powerfully, sometimes even more so, alone. Today I wanted to try and demonstrate that by examining a particularly potent PDF amongst my collection in isolation. This whole episode is dedicated to showcasing this one single document, a copy of which will be linked in the episode's description. The document in question is a copy of the Leeds University student magazine, the Gryphon, published in May of 1939. Undoubtedly, it is the date of this document's publication that is the first hint of its importance. Just 3 months later, Britain would declare war with Germany, igniting 6 years of global death and destruction. Britain was awash with fear, skepticism, anger, confusion. Talk of instigating national conscription to the military had already begun. Men aged between 20 and 22 were given parliamentary approval in the Military Training Act of May 1939, requiring them to undertake 6 months military training, and some 250,000 men registered for this service. Leeds' student population makes for a fascinating cohort in attempting to examine the mood of the nation in the final days before the outbreak of war. It is also a fascinating insight into student life in the 1930s, or indeed life as a young person in the city. So, open up the document if you'd like, and follow along, and let's dive in. We're greeted with the journal's front cover, the title The Gryphon in large green text occupying the top third of the page. In the lower 2/3 of the page is a marvellous illustration of a green griffin, the mythological creature with the body of a lion and head and wings of an eagle. The griffin is holding a red shield, a version of the university's shield with 3 stars, much like the Leeds crest, an open book with some Latin and a Yorkshire rose. Finally, the price, 6d, meaning a sixpence, the D coming from the Latin denarius, which was the standard Roman silver coin. A sixpence was worth half a shilling, or 1/40th of a pound sterling. God bless the metric system. The opening few pages of advertisements feature some wonderful graphic design and some familiar names. Ormax, glass pottery in China, was a Leeds institution for decades. Many famous makers of the time made products specifically for Ormax, in a time where you were much more likely to rent such items than to buy them. There is an advert offering typing services. Remember, in 1939, this was a specific skill that not everyone had. Typewriters were the only thing that you could type on, no computers or laptops. The QWERTY keyboard layout, which we take for granted today, was developed for typewriters in the 1870s. And there are full-page adverts for the National Union of Teachers and the Teachers' Provident Society, the latter of which employing some striking hand-drawn design. Both organisations still exist today, working largely in partnership with each other. The Teachers' Provident Society is what is known in the UK as a friendly society. Before modern insurance and the welfare state, friendly societies provided financial and social services to individuals, often according to their religious, political, or trade affiliations. The TPS, the Teachers Provident Society, transferred its business to Liverpool Victoria Friendly Society, known as popular insurer LV, in 2015. A lot of this will potentially sound very bizarre to you depending on your age. To millennials and younger, the idea that anything like this could be administered by anything other than the state or a massive private company seems bizarre. Normal people collectively organising in their own self-interest to support each other almost seems like fantasy, which is one of the reasons why history is so important to me, to show that there are so many different ways to tackle a problem. The temptation is to view human history as a constant series of progression, that the ideas that take hold over centuries must surely be the best ones. Well, not always. Just after the table of contents is an advert for the Mount Hotel on Clarendon Road. I'd heard of the Mount before, but what caught my eye here was the mention of 100 bedrooms, all with hot and cold running water. 100 bedrooms. So this wasn't the small guest house I'd imagined. After some digging, I learnt that the building is sadly no more. It was actually an amalgamation of numbers 25 and 27 Springfield Mount. Isabella Ford, trade unionist and women's activist, was born in number 27 in 1855. After the two houses' amalgamation and time spent as the Mount Hotel, the buildings were used by the NHS until their demolition in the late 1990s. A community health trust facility, known as the Mount, which replaced some of the services of High Roads Hospital, stands there today. The first real piece of writing we have the opportunity to read is the opening editorial, and what a fascinating piece of writing it is. It is as self-assured as it is scolding. Not that our ideals have failed us, but that we found that you did not want to hear them. Once we tried to write on a subject of deeper importance than union affairs. Once only. Perhaps the loss is yours. It sounds as though the editor tried to include content in previous issues that some students pushed back against, thought were unnecessarily political. And to me, this is quite a confrontational closing statement to your year as editor. It feels fascinatingly illuminating of the mood at the time, and one that feels all too familiar today. The Third Reich sat just across the Channel, rapidly advancing through Europe. Up until this point, Britain had arguably done its best to look away and not get involved. The Battle of Holbeck Moor, which saw some 30,000 local people protest against Oswald Mosley and his 1,000 or so black shirts, had occurred just 3 years before in 1936. The world, Europe, Britain, Leeds, was divided, much as it is again now. To what extent do we sacrifice our own comfort to help our fellow human? After much digging and resorting to checking the first edition of this academic year, I found the editor, and thus the author of those words, to be Matthew H. Scargill. In the first publication of the academic year, there's a section introducing everyone, and his description reads, "Speaks with a foreign accent, owing to prolonged study of Old Norse. Now doing research in Old English. Private life is extremely interesting, but not fit for publication. Democrat with revolutionary tendencies. Was sober on Bizarre Day last year." I also read his opening editorial back in October 1938 and found this paragraph interesting. "We are not pacifists, but we should hesitate before we killed a fellow man. Certainly we have an ideal for which, at times, we feel that we might fight to the end. But we are also human and fond of life, and we remember that honour has no skill in surgery. We would defend our ideal, but we would force it upon no one. We would not fight for a system which has the exploitation of men as its basis." I became increasingly curious about Matthew Scargill after reading his words, and wanted to know more about him. He was born in 1916 in Barnsley, and studied linguistics at the University of Leeds, eventually leaving with a PhD. I found him next in 1948, aboard the RMS Parthia, the second of two all first-class transatlantic passenger cargo liners built for the Cunard Line. The passenger list shows Matthew and his wife Eileen destined for Canada, where over the next 5 decades, Professor Matthew Scargill at the then small University of Victoria went on to pioneer the use, documentation and understanding of Canadian English via a series of dictionaries. He is apparently still fondly remembered at Ivy's bookshop on Oak Bay Avenue, where he would pick up murder mystery novels weekly until his death in 1997. Following the opening editorial are a series of notes and comments, some of them absolutely fascinating with hindsight. My favourite is the somewhat cryptic reference to Coca-Cola. How many people have sampled this beverage in JCR during the free period, and when will the brewers take the hint? My assumption is that students were very keen to see Coca-Cola more widely available. The JCR refers to the Junior Common Room, a term which has fallen out of use at most UK universities, although Devonshire Halls at Leeds still does have a JCR. The concept of a common room was something I actually had to look up and isn't something that exists, to my knowledge, at former polytechnic universities like the one I attended. Other notes are altogether more haunting. Word to the examinees. It would be unwise to fail your exams because of a war scare. There is such a thing as caution, even in Hitler's skull, and he is not likely to throw away his recent gains in one mad rush. Newspapers are printed to be sold. The more startling their news, the bigger their sale. It's very easy to perceive the Second World War as entirely inevitable now, but this is a poignant reminder that to normal people, it perhaps wasn't so obvious. Indeed, much of the horror about to unfold had to feel inconceivable to all but the most pessimistic. Otherwise, day-to-day life would have been remarkably difficult to progress. The opening section finishes with another term I had to look up, valet, a now fairly out-of-use word meaning a farewell or goodbye. Fittingly enough, after declining use from the early 1800s, there was a brief spike of increased use around the 1930s. The short article, Dull Provincial Towns, was written by the Gryphon's new incoming editor, Alan Petch, a Scotsman. Like a lot of the material, it has a whimsical, academic wandering quality to it. We are so accustomed to Leeds as we know it that we forget how temporary a phenomenon it is. Time, like an ever-flowing stream, does bear all its suns away. In the past, there were periods which seem to have rolled along, not indeed with the pleasant languor of a summer afternoon, but at least without the tension which precedes the storm, or the storm itself, or the vigour and freshness afterwards. Our time is one of tension. Our world, to use a phrase which has become trite, stands on the brink of destruction. You have the chance of seeing people not merely reacting to normal circumstances, but to a danger, in no melodramatic sense, greater than ever before. You can see how some are prepared to gamble with destruction for mere power, how some see it only in the chance of a gigantic profit-making scheme, how some manage to keep their heads well enough to make jokes, and how others complain bitterly that evacuation means that they may be expected to give lodging to the wrong type of child. In short, you are allowed to see that, if the worst comes to the worst, posterity will be able to say they retained all their faculties till the very end. There is no escaping the tension throughout the magazine. This feeling that everyone is processing the moral quandary of impending war. But life must go on, and fittingly following this article is a lovely poem signed off by Connor, bringing it right back to student life. Prelude to Finals. Oh, won't it be grand on that last afternoon when we totter from practical chem, when finals are over and done with, but soon there's results, we'll forget about them. A week of suspense in the hottest June days. Oh, that question now, what did it mean? At last we can sprawl on the lawn and just laze. No, we can't. There's a mowing machine. Even here they frustrate us. Now my apparatus. How much do you think I'll get for it? Enough for the fee for some digs by the sea. I'll go as a tripper on Blackpool's Big Dipper. I'll shoot up the tower at least every hour. Oh, that would be great, I'd adore it. Have done with this daydream, you mustn't forget. You've H1 and H2 and H3 to do yet. You're surrounded by textbooks and menaced by June. Oh, won't it be grand on that last afternoon? A bit further on, there is an open letter signed by a number of different students and academics at the university. It is addressed to the editor, yet I also notice it is signed by him, and it is titled Moral Rearmament. Moral Rearmament was an international moral and spiritual movement started by Frank Buchman's Oxford Group, a Christian organisation founded by the Lutheran Buchman. They believe that the root of all society's problems, and therefore the world's, stemmed from individual fear and selfishness. In the face of literal rearmament as Europe descended into war, the group coined the expression moral rearmament, which became its new name. Interestingly, the co-founders of the Alcoholics Anonymous group met through the Oxford Group in 1935 and used its tenets to form the first 12-step program. At this point in 1939 and the writing of this article, moral rearmament was seen as the ideological weapon against fascism. Since the end of the war, things have gotten more complicated for the actual group itself. Since renamed Initiatives of Change, actress Glenn Close has described growing up in the movement as like being in a cult. A few more pages further along, there is a short section simply titled Facts. Mr. Chamberlain owns 11,000 shares in Imperial Chemicals. The chairman of the Industrial Advisory Panel set up to restrict profits is J.S. Addison, managing director of Coulthard's. Coulthard's is closely linked with German and Italian rayon trusts. Rayon is of great importance in wartime. A member of the same panel is Sir G. Beharrell, the chairman of the Dunlop Rubber Company, which has made most of the civilian gas masks. A further member, Francis Cooper, is chairman of Lever Bros. This firm is a generous contributor to the Anglo-German Fellowship. Sir J. Anderson, before becoming Minister of Defence, was a director of Imperial Chemicals and Vickers, the arms firm. L.S. Amory, a great supporter of conscription, has connections with Camel Laird, steel firm. Concrete slabs supplied to a certain town for lining ARP trenches crumbled into dust when rubbed together. And storm lamps, bearing the legend, Made in Germany, were issued to one town for ARP work. This series of statements fascinates me. It is clear that people were very well aware of the immense contradictions at play, the corrupted interests, the questionable allegiances. This is the real and much more complicated situation that people were faced with. Knowing the Nazis should be stopped, but also knowing that, at some stage, the whole thing is an elaborate chess game for the very few, whose loyalties lie not with nations, but their personal wealth and power. Now I have barely scratched the surface of this one single document. There is so much more that there is to potentially discuss and analyse, and I highly encourage you to download it and do so. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope I've shown the immense power a single document can possess when combined with the right historical context and information. It can be a great starting point to expand your knowledge of wider events, whilst viewing them through a much more relatable, personal lens. After all, history shouldn't just be about the events themselves, but the people who created them.